Good day, everybody, and welcome to Rocky Mountain Readings, where we've been into the beautiful book, the Talmud, a biography, and I am finding this some historical refreshing for sure. Learning yesterday about how the schools in Babylon developed and started the debates that actually led to the formation of the Talmud, and then they got into the rise of the rise of Islam, which actually enabled the Talmud to be passed throughout North Africa and certain areas of the world, but how it was originally only known in Jerusalem and those in Babylon, and how the formation of Baghdad happened. It was just some interesting historical points for sure. Definitely useful material, and so we're going to continue with that today. But I may end a little early today because I have to write an exam for my security license later on. So I need to cram in a little more study to make sure I'm well prepared. So let's just roll with it and see where we get. We left off here yesterday, shared ideas, the Talmud in Islam. So let's continue from there. Hope everybody's enjoying this book. As their links with the new metropolis strengthened, the luminaries of Surah and Pumbedita found they had much in common with their opposite numbers in the Islamic world. They discovered they were grappling with similar issues, actively applying their scholarship, legal, and religious traditions to regulate the day-to-day lives of their co-religionists. Each faith influenced the other. This is obvious both from the structure of their legal systems and some of their legislation itself. Their influence upon each other was more than just a simple two-way process. Gideon Libson explains it as a feedback model in which the Talmudic system first impacted Islam, which at a later stage left its imprint on Talmudic law. Both Islam and Judaism are religions which minutely regulate every aspect of the believer's life. They're each based on a God-given written document, the Torah for Judaism and the Quran for Islam. These divine texts are each interpreted and expanded upon by an oral tradition, the Talmud and the Hadith, respectively. Both traditions contain legal and ethical material, and the legal material in each distinguishes between religious laws and social laws. The Jewish system of law is called halakha. The Islamic system is called sharia. Both names mean a pathway or way to go. Unlike Christianity, the laws and beliefs in Islam and Judaism are derived through a process of reasoning and scholarship. They're very important. There are no councils or synods to rule on doctrine, ethics, or behavior. In fact, the two religions are so close in terms of their structure that the 10th century rabbinic leader Sadia Gaon would unself-consciously refer to Jewish law as Sharia, to the prayer leader in a synagogue as an imam, and the direction in which Jews faced when praying as the Qibla. Although in these twin systems, the Quran and Torah parallel each other as divinely revealed written texts, the Quran was written down long after the Torah. So whilst we find characters, ideas, and motifs from the Torah in the Quran, we shouldn't expect to find them the other way round. However, the Talmud and Quran do originate from a similar period, and it's not hard to find concepts from the Talmud occurring in both the Quran and Hadith, and vice versa. One such case is the ritual definition of daybreak. The Quran defines the moment of daybreak when the faithful must begin to fast during Ramadan as when the white thread of dawn becomes distinct to you from the black thread. Similarly, the Jewish Mishnah rules that the morning prayer is to be said when the worshiper can distinguish between blue and white. Both traditions use the same analogy to emphasize the sanctity and uniqueness of every human life. The Quran states that we decreed upon the children of Israel that whoever kills a soul, it is as if he had slain mankind entirely. And whoever saves one, it is as if he saved mankind entirely. This is a reference to the passage from the Mishnah that Adam was created alone to teach you that whoever takes a human life is considered by the Bible to have destroyed the entire world. And whoever saves a human life is considered by the Bible as if he preserved the entire world. Initially, Jewish ideas found their way into Islam, but the process subsequent reversal can be spotted in matters of finance and commerce. Talmudic law matured in Baghdad in a commercial Islamic environment, and Shmuel had already declared that when it came to civil law, the law of the land is the law. This gave the Gaonim flexibility in commercial matters to amend or even abrogate Talmudic sanction as necessary. We can see an example of this flexibility in the laws governing money transfers. The Talmud had instituted that as a precaution against fraud, merchants could not transfer money by bills of exchange even when these were countersigned by witnesses. However, a Geonic ruling overturned this ruling on the basis that people were already doing it and that it was in accordance with the Islamic laws that regulated merchants. It is true, between the faiths, it's pretty likely that the Talmudic and Islamic systems of law each influenced each other. Talmudic and Islamic scholars cross-fertilized in legal matters because they lived in the same mercantile society. But the two traditions didn't just overlap when it came to the law. Storytelling was an art in the folklore-rich Arabian world. Amongst the few things that the patchwork of Jewish sects in the Arabian Peninsula had in common was the repository of folklore. The Talmud had drawn on some of it, but there was much more which it did not absorb, including literature linked to the secessionist priestly sect at Qumran, who are best known as the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Early Islam had drawn in Jewish converts who recounted these Dead Sea tales along with everyone else based on their memories of legends they had heard as Jews. As these stories began to circulate, they took on an Islamic guise. The more they were repeated in the Islamic world, the more they were adapted to fit the cultural context. This folklore, which became known as Israeliyat, was not always looked upon kindly by Islamic leaders. It frequently came in for fierce censure. The Egyptian scholar Ahmad Shakir explains that Israeliyat literature can only be regarded as supporting mainstream Islamic traditions. It should not be relied unless it is confirmed by the Quran and Hadith. Amongst the many Jewish converts whose stories entered Islamic hagiography, two in particular stood out. Kabal Abar, a Yemenite Jew, is thought to have been one of Caliph Umar's closest advisors. Amongst the sayings attributed to him is that all human history is alluded to in the Jewish Torah. The Talmudic idea first expressed by the intriguingly named Ben Bagbag. Another convert, or possibly the son of one, Wab ibn Munabi, wrote or contributed to a work known as Qisas al-Anbiya, the Tales of the Prophets, which recounts Jewish biblical legends recast in Islamic guise. Qisas al-Anbiya is considered to be the source for the Islamic belief that Abraham is commanded to sacrifice Ishmael rather than Isaac, as the Hebrew Bible has it. The Quran does not say which son was nearly sacrificed. Wab's other major work, Kitab al-Israeliyat, or Book of Jewish Matters, no longer exists, but some of its tales appear in an Islamic context in the 1001 Nights. Temporal power and scholarly authority. The Geonim, as heads of the academies, had a far more exalted status than their counterparts during the Talmudic times. We know the names of hundreds of Amorim, academy heads, senior scholars, and students. In the latter period, however, with very few exceptions, we only know the names of the Geonim. They seem to have ruled with far greater authority than the heads of the Amoric academies, and they kept their offices within the leading families. The position of heads of the academies frequently passed from father to son or from one brother to another. Unlike their compatriots in Israel, the Jews of Babylon were tolerated by their Islamic rulers. Together with other minority religions, they were free to worship according to their faith as long as they did nothing to offend Islam. Uh, Pirkoi ben Baboy, a 9th century Talmudist, recounts that the two academies in Babylon did not witness imprisonment, forced conversions, or plunder, nor were they dominated by Greece or Rome. Nevertheless, the caliph ruled supreme. His empire was vast and diverse. To hold it all together required strong military, political, and diplomatic control. Even though the exilarch was appointed by the heads of the yeshiva and the elders of the community, his tenure was now to be ratified by the caliph, and his court was to be relocated from Mohoza to Baghdad. There was to be no repetition of Mar Zutra's attempt to establish an independent Jewish state, nor would the commander of the faithful permit a repetition of the exilarch Bustanai's alliance with the Sasanian Empire when Caliph Umar's forces had first invaded. We encountered Bustanai's son discussing the names of the stars in Joseph's dream with the prophet Muhammad in Medina. Most of Bustanai's life is the stuff of legend, and it's hard to unravel the historical detail. But a version of his legend are attested in several Muslim and Jewish sources. There is probably a historical core to it. Bustanai's father, the previous exilarch, had been slain by one of the Sasanian kings. The accounts differ as to which monarch it was. One night, King David, the traditional ancestor of the exilarchs, appeared in a dream to the Sasanian monarch and warned him, on pain of death, to stop slaying his descendants, seeking to put right his office. The king took the orphaned Bustani under his wing and appointed him exilarch. Bustani's followers fought with the Sasanians against the Muslim invaders, but it was no more than an alliance of convenience. Following the Muslim victory, he signed a peace pact with Caliph Umar. As part of the deal, Umar gave him one of the daughters of the defeated Sasanian king as a wife. Bustani now had two wives, one Jewish and one Persian. However, the Persian wife was a prisoner of war, was technically a slave, and the sons of his Jewish wife tried to exclude her children from inheriting the father's title. The scholars of the Babylonian academies found in favor of the children of the Persian princess, ruling that Bustani had liberated her from the status as a slave. Bustani's descendants from each branch of his family eventually became exilarchs, but 300 years later, the matter was still being hotly disputed. The legitimacy of the Persian line challenged by the then leader of the Babylonian community, Haggaon. The powers of Bustani's successors under the caliphate, although diminished from their peak under Sasanian rule, were nevertheless considerable. Although the exilarch no longer had the right to judge criminal cases, other than in exceptional circumstances, he was still able to levy taxes upon his Jewish subjects. According to one report, he would collect 20% of their income, together with a portion of any produce and additional levies whenever a house was built or a wedding conducted. The exilarch resided in state in a palace stretching from the Barley Gate to the Heranian Arch in the western quarter of the city. Once crowned in an elaborate feast during which he would be showered with gifts, he remained in his palace. He would only leave if summoned to visit the caliph, when he would travel in a royal carriage accompanied by his entourage, their numbers swelled by onlookers who would join the throng as the exilarch traveled through the city. Shalom, Sheila. But for the exilarch's grandeur, he was merely the embodiment of temporal authority. He sat at the head of society, but he did little for it that was not ceremonial. His memory endures solely due to the enterprise of his scholarly colleagues, those who were working to fulfill their perceived spiritual mission. It was the Geonim who were responsible for the legal and social structures that would allow the Talmud to grow beyond Baghdad and to exert its influence on a world that was growing ever more connected. From Your Father's House, Chapter 6. Ben Zoma said, "Who is wise? He who learns from all men. Who is mighty? He who subdues his passions. Who is rich? He who rejoices in his portion." the Talmud's expanding influence. Both the Talmudic and Islamic scholars shared the same imperative to extend their authority beyond their immediate neighborhood. It was important for the Islamic scholars because the faith was relatively new, the empire was still expanding, and there were many areas that were not yet fully Islamized. It mattered to the Talmudic scholars because the small Jewish nation was scattered over a vast geographical area, and the danger was that without a center of influence, the faith may weaken and dissipate. There was also the question of the Jerusalem Talmud, which still exerted its authority in regions which the Babylonians wished to reach. Although Israel was the ancestral homeland, its impoverished community was lacking in leadership and serious legal scholarship. Its main cultural activity had for some time been the production of poetry and biblical interpretation, disciplines which the scholarly Geonim considered relatively unimportant. Shalom, Cookie Monster! In the early days, Babylon had accepted the authority of the scholars in the Holy Land without question. Now this was no longer the case. The last time we hear of Babylonian scholar applying to the academy in Israel for the answer to a problem was in the late 5th century. As scholarship in one center blossomed and the other faded, the contest between the two Talmuds for influence was to grow increasingly trenchant. The Babylonian Talmud's position at the heart of the Islamic Empire gave its advocates an advantage over its hard-pressed rivals in Israel. The majority of Jews lived under Islamic rule and and it was far easier to communicate with them from Baghdad than from Jerusalem. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, the sectarian threat had not been dispelled. There was a growing body of dissenting voices within the Jewish world, sects which had never been part of the rabbinic camp or which had become disillusioned with it and now tolerated the caliphate were becoming more vociferous. Spreading the Talmud far and wide was one of the strategies the Geonim would try to use to bring these communities into the mainstream. It was no coincidence that the scholars of both faiths used identical tools to promote the fruits of their labors. One was the new science of codification, which reduced complex legal discussions to systematic, logically arranged summations of the law. The other was the well-established craft of letter writing. Even today, when printing has standardized the Talmud text, it is astonishing how few of the discussions it contains end up with a definite legal conclusion, most of which were added in by later editors. The Talmud was not then and is still not a rule book. Okay, that's something that you guys need to understand. It's not a rule book. Its genius lies in taking the detailed case law of the Mishnah, defining the principles and concepts that underlie it, and advancing arguments that can be used to underpin a subsequent legal ruling. Very important. Its lack of clarity, its tendency to avoid decisions, was not unusual for its time. The whole business of making laws evolved very slowly in all ancient societies over a period of several centuries. In fact, up to this point, the connected world had only ever known one true legal code. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I assumed power in 527, he found Roman law in a terrible mess, completely disorganized and with no formal structure. He immediately appointed a commission to go through all legal material, verbal and written, to eliminate contradictions, get rid of redundancies, and put the whole thing into a systematic order. The result was the Justinian Code of Roman Civil Law. It functioned as the law book of the Byzantine Empire and influenced all subsequent legal developments wherever Roman influence was still felt. The Justinian Code had been formulated in the Roman West in the 6th century, but it wasn't until the late 8th century that a flurry of codification activity broke out amongst major religions in the East. Islam, Zoroastrianism, Monophysite Christianity, Neo-Nestorianism, and Judaism all produced legal codes. Benjamin Jokish suggests that the starting point for all these activities was in and around Baghdad. He conjectures that the Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his childhood teacher, subsequently to be appointed vizier, Ya, Ya, Yahya ibn Khalid, organized roundtable sessions in which leading representatives of the different faiths had the opportunity to exchange ideas. Jokish even proposes that, just as Justinian had done, al-Rashid may have set up a legal commission comprising both Islamic and Talmudic jurists, with the different religious parties each laying down a codex of their own. He suggests that Shimon Kayara and Pikoi ben Baboy may have been amongst the Jewish members of the commission. Shimon Kayara has gone down in history as an instrumental figure in the process of codifying and systematizing Talmudic law. A 9th century comprehensive legislative code, Halkot Gedolat, is attributed to him. If Jokish is right, then it would have been this code that he worked on in the Caliph's interfaith legal commission. But Halkot Gedolat was only one of the least 3 codifications of Talmudic law that emerged around the same time. Another was Halkot Pesukot, said to have been produced by Yehudai Gaon. It's hard to know which came first. Modern academic opinions are divided as to which of these 2 codes, if either, influenced the other, whether or not they really are different versions of the same work, and even whether Shimon Kayara and Yehudai Gaon really were the authors. But while all this is unclear, there is no doubt that the production of these 2 codes was a seminal development in clarifying the legal rulings of the Talmud and projecting its influence beyond Babylon. The third summary of Talmudic law was written by the head of the Pambida Academy, Achai Gaon, known as the Sheil. It was very different from the other 2 works. It became much more popular. Achai had spent 13 years living in Israel after the Exilarch refused to appoint him as the head of the Pambida Academy. It was there that he learnt new techniques for drawing ideas out of the biblical text. He used them to good effect in his Sheil. Unlike the authors of Halchot Gedolat and Halchot Pesukot, Achai didn't arrange the laws according to topic. Instead, he linked them to the text of the 5 books of Moses, and he did so with a homiletic eye, often leading to some quite odd results. The laws of robbery are not included, as one might think, after thou shalt not steal in the 10 Commandments. Instead, they are used to expand the story of Noah, which the Bible introduces with the words, and the earth was filled with violence. For Achai, that violence was characterized by robbery. That violence mentioned in Hebrew has pecuniary overtones, meaning monetary theft. Yeah. Sheil is based on the Talmud and draws its material from there, yet it was composed before the final version of the Talmud. This shows us just how fluid the editing process of the Talmud was and how long it survived in an oral form before it was finally written down. Questions and answers. Codification enables people to access a concise summary of the law, but codes in themselves didn't help much in building relationships between the academies and distant communities. A far more effective way for the Talmudic and Sharia scholars to establish their authority was by corresponding with their co-religionists and answering their questions and providing religious guidance. The Jews called these answers teshuvot, and the Muslims called them fatwas. Academics of all faiths and none call them responsa. In the second half of the 9th century, the leader of the Surah Academy, Amram Gaon, received a question from the Jewish community in Spain, possibly Barcelona. It concerned a Talmudic injunction that one should recite 100 blessings each day. This injunction doesn't receive a lot of attention in the Talmud. The discussion in which it occurs moves on quite quickly. But it was important to the people who sent the question. They wanted to know, what are these 100 blessings? Amram's predecessors and teacher, Netroni had previously been asked a similar question by lots of Lucena and Cordoba, but whilst he refers to Netroni's answer, Amram's response was far more detailed. Shalom, Dave. Amram's reply, addressed with the flamboyant courtesy of the age to Rabbi Isaac, son of our rabbi and teacher Shimon, beloved, exalted, and honored by us, and the entire yeshiva, is effectively the earliest known prayer book. In it, he sets out the blessings, the times they are to be recited, and manner of their recital. Of course, he didn't intend it to be a prayer book. Such a thing was unheard of in those days. All Amram was doing was to answer a question posed by a remote community, but in such detail and in such a prescriptive manner that he reinforced the Babylonian Talmud as the natural and only source for determining Jewish law and practice. The Geonim didn't invent the practice of sending teshuvot. Missives containing legal decisions were already well established by their time. The Roman Emperor Augustus had long ago appointed official jurists who had the right to issue responsa on behalf of the emperor. The Talmud itself contains a dispute in which Rav Kahana, whom we met when he was forced to flee Babylon for Israel, was accused of erecting a fence which encroached on his neighbor's land. This was in the days when the academy in Israel was still considered the supreme authority. Kana denied the charge and offered to bring a letter from the West confirming that his understanding of the law was correct. But although the practice was well established, the sending of written answers accelerated in the Geonic period. Sometimes, as in the case of Amram, the answers were in response to a question from a distant locale. At other times, the answers were sent at the Gaon's initiative to make a particular point or preempt a forthcoming situation from developing. Some of the earliest responses sent to local towns or communities dealt with issues that arose due to the interlocking of Talmudic and Sharia law. One early incident concerning the laws of divorce. The Talmudic custom had been that when a wife wanted a divorce, there should be a 12-month cooling off period. This restriction did not apply in Islamic law, and some Jewish women, unwilling to wait a full year, gave up on their Jewish divorce and married Muslim men. This seems to have obligated the Jewish courts to order an immediate divorce, though it's not clear whether this was due to pressure from the Islamic authorities. In any event, around the year 650, two of the early Geonim, Huna and Rava, sent out letters authorizing divorces to be given immediately so that women would no longer need to resort to the Islamic courts. The system of sending written answers to distant communities was less than sophisticated. Very often, no record of either the question or the response was preserved in the academy. So the Talmud scholars in Babylon frequently did not know decisions circulated by earlier generations, even though these decisions were known elsewhere. Some of the rulings of Yehudai Gaon, who was active around 760 CE, only became known in Babylon 100 years later, when they arrived back in Baghdad, brought by Jewish captives from Christian countries. By Amram Gaon's time, responses were being sent to communities throughout the Islamic Empire. Most of the traffic was with settlements in Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. The 19th century discovery of 1,000 years of religious and secular Hebrew documents stored in the synagogue attic at Fustat, Cairo, has unearthed hundreds of responsa, covering everything from the most technical laws about ritually unfit meat to obscure religious customs and ceremonies that were unique maybe only to a handful of villages. One 10th century letter found in the Cairo Geniza, which made its way to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, was published in 1906, tells us that in the middle of the 9th century, another of the Geonim, Paltoy, was asked by a group in Spain to send them a copy of the Talmud together with explanations, and this he duly did. Unfortunately, we have no other evidence of this back in Baghdad, brought by Jewish captives from Christian countries. By Amram Gaon's time, responsa were being sent to communities throughout. Oh, hold on. We have no other evidence of this, so it's hard to know exactly what is meant. It's pretty certain that the full 1.8 million word document that we know today had not yet crystallized into a format that could be written down. It is likely, therefore, that Paltoy sent them extracts, an abridgment, or an explanation of what the Talmud was. The responsa functioned as more than just ritual guides in legal decisions. A Gaon might sometimes decide to send one for propaganda purposes or to drive home a polemic point. None was better at this than Pirkoi ben Baboy, even though he wasn't a Gaon. Pirkoi was born towards the end of the 8th century and was a pupil of Yehuda Gaon, whose responsa had been brought back by captives to Baghdad a century after they had been written. What makes him particularly interesting is that he used his responsa to fight two battles at the same time. Pirkoi's most famous letter, known quite simply as the Letter of Pirkoi ben Baboy, was ostensibly written to communities in Israel, pointing out that many of their practices were not in line with the rulings of the Babylonian Talmud. His teacher Yehudai had tried something similar and had been rebuffed. Their heirs to the Jerusalem Talmud were not going to be dictated by those of the Babylonian version. The Academy in Israel had told Yehudai that their traditions were firmly established and that in matters of ritual, a long-established tradition overrides a theoretical law. Paltoy tried a different approach. He sent his letter not just to Israel, but to Jews in Rouen, then an important city about 100 miles from the modern Tunis. Kerouain had a large and thriving Jewish community. The city enjoyed economic stability, and its Jewish community was well educated. Cookie Monster, you got an off-topic question? Yeah, write it down in there. I'll do my best to answer. And its Jewish community was well educated, with close ties to their co-religionists in Spain, who they helped to establish their own centers of learning. Pirkoi pointed out to the Jews in Kerouain that the traditions observed in Israel were unique to that country and had been forced upon them by persecutions. Even though the citizens of Kerouain were in close contact with and traveled frequently to Israel, there had been no persecutions in Kerouain. There was no reason, therefore, for the Jews there to mimic practices in Israel. They couldn't use the same argument as the Jerusalem Academy to do things that were not in accord with the Babylonian Talmud. What Pirkoi was really doing in copying his letter to Kerouain, and probably elsewhere as well, was to raise the stakes in a battle between the two Talmuds for religious authority. He recognized the strategic value of establishing the authority of the Babylonian Talmud in that city. By starting from a position which claimed Israel was wrong and Babylon was right, he was doing what polemicists have done since time immemorial. He was framing the debate in terms which made his position correct from the outset. Cookie, of course it is, and it's more than just permissible; it's encouraged. Um, yeah, and all I can say is that Hashem desires that people repent, and be encouraged by that. That he desires that people repent. So choose in life. I don't know the whole story, but don't be so discouraged if it's a past mistake from years and years and years ago. Just do repentance and do not repeat the action. But I don't know what the story is, Cookie. But be bold and make sure you address Hashem as King of the universe and be sincere in your heart, and He knows the contrite heart and the genuine temperament of your repentance. And yeah, ask Him to lead you in a path that doesn't go through the same kind of trials. Be blessed, Cookie. But this wasn't all. Pirkoi may have believed firmly that the Babylonian Talmud was the more authentic because it had never been forced to seek compromise with oppressors. But nevertheless, the struggle between the two Talmuds was an internal matter. There was a far more urgent battle looming against a Jewish sectarian group known as the Karaites, who, like the Sadducees some centuries earlier, did not accept the oral law at all. Overcoming the Karaites was Pirkoi's real aim, and he could argue for the validity of the oral law if there were two Talmuds with conflicting practices, each claiming to represent the authentic tradition, each contradicting each other. That was the real reason Pirkoi was insistent that the Jews of Kairouan followed the dominant Babylonian Talmud. He wanted to take the Jerusalem Talmud out of the picture altogether. Okay, the Karaites. The two Talmuds may have struggled for dominance out of the competing sense of superiority, but they were about to be hit by a challenge that was wholly out of their control. Nobody had seen what was coming when, in the second half of the 8th century, an exilarch in waiting, Anan ben David, was passed over for the job in favor of his brother, nor when some years later his grandson Daniel became embroiled in a separate dispute over the succession. The fact that another member of Anan's family, a man named Josiah, was the head of the academy in Israel did nothing to help. Anan was a charismatic intellectual who attracted followers towards him, polymaths with interests in law, philosophy, language, and biblical interpretation. His disenchantment with the Talmudic establishment may have been why he didn't get the post of exilarch, or it may have been a consequence of his rejection. Either way, he began to explore the origins of Talmudic religion and to enter into dialogue with other dissenting Jewish sects, including Abu Isa's movement and the Yudganites, a Jewish sect influenced by Sufism. An amalgamation of sorts began to take place by the 9th century. The coalition, although patchy at first, had developed its own distinctive identity and taken a name that implied followers of the Bible, thus making it clear they were no disciples of the Talmud. The Karaites actively recruited converts and established communities across the Islamic and Byzantine empires. The two academies of Babylon and Israel still each other suspiciously had bigger threat to deal with than any other they had previously known. The Karaites' fundamental premise was the rejection of Talmudic Judaism in favor of literal interpretation of the Bible. This did not mean that they had no traditions or biblical interpretations of their own. It would be very difficult to take the Bible at face value without any need for interpretation or explanation. The Karaites had their own principle for interpreting the Bible, but they rejected out of hand the idea of an oral law handed down from Mount Sinai, of which the Talmud was the summation, just as the earlier Sadducees, with whom they share many similarities, had rejected the oral law adhered to by the Pharisees. And yeah, we see the Sadducees fell by the wayside, and even today you see Karaites are dwindled down to nothing. Pirkei ben Baboy believed the Karaite threat could only be contained if the struggle between the academies was resolved. A divided Talmud played into the hands of those who opposed it. Dissent could only be contained by a single universally accepted legal authority. He used his letter to highlight seemingly minor points of law, which he believed illustrated the failings of the Israel Academy. He railed against them for hesitating over whether the Sabbath regulations prohibiting the lighting of fires could be overruled to heat water for a woman in labor. All agreed that preservation of life came ahead of everything else, and therefore he argued there was no question that a fire must be lit. But his real purpose in this argument was to point the finger at the Karaites, who took the biblical prohibition against lighting a fire on the Sabbath literally and would spend the whole day with no heat and no light. By accusing the scholars in Israel of endangering women in childbirth by not lighting fires, he was, by implication, accusing the Karaites of an even greater recklessness in ignoring the oral law's interpretation of a biblical commandment. They risked the lives of anyone who needed to be warned on the Sabbath for the sake of their health. Pirkoi didn't just use legal arguments against the Karaites, he appealed to their interest in biblical interpretation by adapting a well-known homily on the verse at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, one which implies that God had offered the Torah to other Middle Eastern tribes before offering it to the Israelites. The original homily, in the original homily, all the tribes had rejected the Torah because it contained too many restrictions. In Pirkoi's adaptation, the tribes had agreed to accept the written Torah, but it was not given to them because they would not accept an oral law. The homily implied that the Karaites were beyond the fold by not accepting the oral law. They had implicitly rejected the written Torah. Nevertheless, despite Pirkoi's best efforts, the Karaites were far and away the most successful of the anti-Talmudic groups and the only one from that period to survive to the present day. They based their interpretation of Bible upon reason. Despite doctrinal differences, they were considered by all parties, including the Talmudists, to be part of the Jewish community. It was their membership of the community, coupled with their opposition to the Talmud, that caused emotions to run so high, and made the dispute so bitter. Much of our knowledge of the Karaites comes from the writings of their 10th century apologist, Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Kirkasani. His Book of Lights and Watchtowers is a detailed description of the many Jewish sects in Babylon and the differences between them. Al-Kirkasani's charge against the Talmud is exactly that which Pirkoi had tried to eliminate, namely that differences of opinions between Talmudic scholars undermines their doctrine of a divinely given oral law. That by definition should be clear and unambiguous. Karaites, on the other hand, say that Al-Kirkasani arrived at our knowledge by the mere deduction of our reasons. Since this is so, it cannot be denied that controversy may possibly arise. Pirkoi ben Baboy did manage to keep the North African communities on side. They didn't place themselves under the authority of the Israeli Academy, as he feared, but other than that, his evangelism for the Babylonian Talmud wasn't particularly successful, not just because the Karaites were growing more numerous and confident daily. He also hadn't really gained any territorial advantage in the battle between the academies. The communities of Syria, Lebanon, and most of Egypt still looked to Israel for guidance. It would take a stronger, more assertive character to strengthen the Babylonian Academy and to take decisive steps toward eliminating the Karaite threat. Sadia's controversy. Pirkoi was an important figure at a particular moment in the story of the Babylonian Talmud. But few people remember him today. Not so Sadia, Gaon of Sura. At the beginning of the 10th century, the Sura Academy was in decline. According to Sharira Gaon's letter, many of the scholars had died within a 3-month period around the year 886 CE. Moshe Gil suggests this may have been the result of a plague. The number of scholars fell away so sharply that when the academy had died in 924, the exilarch had to recruit from outside the academy. He appointed a local lay scholar, a weaver by profession, as Gaon. 4 years later, when the weaver died, the academy was in danger of closing. The exilarch David ben Zakkai appointed another outsider, this time Sadia ben Yosef, who had been making something of a name for himself in Baghdad. Sadia had been born in Fayum in Egypt. He was known locally as al-Fayumi. Like the Karaites, Sadia had been influenced by the rationalist Islamic school of Mutazilite philosophy. He wrote prolifically on philosophy, biblical interpretation, and grammar. People still read his works today. Sadia was a great scholar, but a quarrelsome man. He had been involved in controversy before his appointment as Gaon of Sura. David, the exilarch, had been warned off the appointment, for Sadia feared no one, deferred to no one in the world because of his great wisdom and his large mouth and his long tongue. No thanks, Subway Switch. Enough of that. Sadia's attitude towards the perceived dangers of charism was far more impassioned than his fellow Talmudists. He had no interest in communal reconciliation. He considered the Karaites to be apostates who should be ostracized by the community. At the age of 23, while still in Egypt, and long before he was appointed Gaon, Sadia had fired his first shot in his war against them, publishing a fierce polemic against the followers of Anan, who at that time still retained a separate identity within the Karaite movement. Not surprisingly, the Karaites regarded him as their main opponent, and they counterattacked vigorously. Salman ben Jerome was particularly abusive towards him. "You have written lies. Where do you flee to hide yourself in utter ruin? May your steps be hampered as you walk." But Sadia wasn't just quarrelsome, he was a good strategist. His persistent attacks achieved the outcome he had wanted, a complete break between the Talmud academies and the Karaites. He didn't get everything right. He strengthened the Karaites by propelling the Ananites, who were his intellectual equals and could hold their own against him in polemic, into a dominant position in charism. Sadia's attacks helped the Karaite ideologues to create a unitary position out of quarreling sects. Charism honed its intellectual edge on the confrontation with Sadia. Without Sadia, charism might have had a very different fate and form. Sadia's quarrelsome reputation wasn't confined to his war against the Karaites. He also had a go at the Jerusalem Talmud. 6 years before his appointment as Gaon, he had instigated the fiercest of all disputes between the adherents of the two Talmuds, a dispute which, to all intents and purposes, finally established the hegemony of the Babylonian school. It all had to do with the fixing of the calendar and a squabble over a couple of missing days. The Talmudic calendar is a unique and complex combination of both the lunar and solar cycles. The months are determined by the new moons. The years are dictated by the position of the earth relative to the sun. There are 12 months in the Talmudic year, but a lunar month is less than 30 days. 12 of them do not add up to a solar year of 365 days. To bring the lunar and solar cycles into line, a rigorous calculation had to be implemented in which some years had additional months inserted, and two particular months could vary between 29 or 30 days. Tradition has it that this calculation was introduced in the year 358 by the Nasi Hillel IV, but Sasha Stern has shown that the development of this hybrid calendar was far more complicated than that. Until Sadia's time, responsibility for performing the calculation and announcing the leap years had rested with the Israel Academy. This was a relic of the custom in the days of the temple before the calculation was introduced, when the rabbis in Jerusalem would call for witnesses to come forward to testify they had seen the new moon. When a pair of reliable informants arrived, the rabbis would proclaim the new month. In the year 922, a dispute broke out for highly technical reasons over whether the two flexible months should have 29 or 30 days. The Gaon in Israel, Ben Mir, held that the 2 months should have 29 days. The Babylonian scholars disagreed. They argued for 30 days. The details of the disagreement may have appeared trivial. They were arguing over a matter of a few minutes here or there, but the consequences were that unless the two academies agreed, the communities over which they held sway would celebrate their festivals on different days. Each school contended that if they followed the opinion of the other, they would be eating forbidden bread on the day that they had calculated to be the Passover. Sadia led the attack on the Nasi's calculations. He wrote to Ben Mir, to his former pupil in Egypt, and to most of the great cities, warning that if the view of the Israel Academy were to be followed, this would lead to a profaning of Passover and the fast day of atonement, which would both be celebrated 2 days earlier than prescribed. Letters and counter letters flew between Babylon and Israel. Ben-Mir seems to have been the more short-tempered of the two protagonists. Sadia managed to keep his cool whilst protesting Ben-Mir's attempts to implement what Sadia, saw as a change to the calendrical rules. The fury with which the dispute was conducted masked a fear which was uppermost in the minds of Talmudic scholars, where a schism to develop in which Israel and Babylon permanently observed different calendars, with their festivals falling on different days. The authority of the Talmud would be seriously compromised. There would, in effect, be two Talmudic sects. It was one thing for the academies in Israel and Babylon to differ over minor points of law, such as heating water on the Sabbath. It was wholly another for them to create an ongoing situation in which one group regarded a certain day as holy, whilst their co-religionists profaned it, in which there was never any possibility that the entire nation would celebrate their festivals as they had been ordained. It would destroy the integrity of the Talmud, and it would hand a victory to the non-Talmudic sects, particularly the Karaites. Despite this fear, the two communities did observe separate festivals in 922. Whoa. We don't know how long this situation went on for or how it was resolved, but when it was all over, it was, of course, Sadia who won the day. His fiery genius, profound learning, and above all, his superior literary skill proved more than a match for his opponent and finally brought about Ben-Mir's overthrow. The ancient privilege of the Israel Academy to set the calendar had been taken from them, and a decisive victory had been won in the battle for dominance of the Babylonian Talmud. Very important point there, folks, to understand. Yeah, you don't want to have their holidays deviate and then have different sects celebrating them on different times, because then one is definitively profaning it. That might have been Sadia's finest hour, but victory over the Israel Academy was by no means the only controversy he was embroiled in. 2 years after his appointment, he fell out with David ben Zakkai, the exilarch who had appointed him. It happened because Sadia had refused to countersign a deed which ruled in favor of one of the parties in a dispute over a large inheritance. The deed would have allowed the exilarch to benefit from a 10% levy on the money collected. A row broke out between Sadia and the exilarch, the Gaon of Pumbedita, who had already signed the deed, weighed in on the exilarch's side. Wealthy Baghdadis took Sadia's part, whilst abusive letters circulated. The exilarch's son threatened to beat Sadia's head with a shoe, a threat which misfired when the enraged students at their yeshiva charged him and struck him with their footwear. The exilarch placed Sadia under a ban. He fled for his life, but not before he had taken his revenge by trying to appoint the exilarch's brother in David's place. The acrimony lasted for 7 years until some of the leading families in Baghdad exerted pressure on the exilarch to make peace with Sadia. The exilarch gave way and consented to a reconciliation ceremony at which Sadia would appear at his house, where a feast would be held, complete with hugs and kisses. Following the reconciliation, Sadia was readmitted to his position of Gaon of Sura, but as part of the peace accord, was obliged to share the post with Joseph ben Jacob, who had been appointed when Sadia was expelled. Fortunately, Joseph was smart enough to know not to aggravate Sadia. Rather than actively participating in the activities of the academy, he stayed at home, all the while continuing to draw his salary. Sadia was a confident and assertive man who was not afraid to stand up for his beliefs and defend his position. Come what may, he may sound like a quarrelsome character, and maybe he was, but he was far more than just that. Sadia was a pioneer in the new form of literature which would come to dominate Talmud scholarship in the medieval period. He wrote treatises on specific topics of laws, in which he gives both the laws of the Talmud proofs underlying them. His topic by topic approach represented a significant development in codification. The earlier works of Shimon Kayara and Yehudai Gaon had followed a more fluid, less systematic arrangement. It wasn't just that he explained the law and made it accessible. He wrote in Arabic, the language which everyone now spoke, rather than Hebrew or Aramaic. This enabled his writings to reach a far wider audience. But Talmud was only one of his literary activities. Sadia spoke and wrote Arabic, but he pioneered the study of Hebrew language, composing some of its most enduring poetry. He wrote commentaries on much of the Hebrew Bible. And you know what? I think, because I've got to study and I've got to write an exam this afternoon, maybe we'll call it a break for today, and we'll come back tomorrow for Coming of Age, where Rabbi Akiva said everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is given. And so I quoted this. This is from Mishnah chapter 3, Mishnah 19. I quoted it last night. I did a broadcast with my friend Steve Eisenhower in that Christian spiritual abuse series. So I'm going to post that up on social media. Check that out, where we talk about the abusive nature of their belief in predetermination. Where they believe, that God predestines people for heaven or hell. And so we talk about that. So I'm going to share that out on social media. Check that out in that spiritual abuse series, and share it if you think it'll help somebody. But please come back and join me tomorrow, where we're going to continue more in the Talmud of Biography. I think today we're learning a lot of what was typically how the Talmud was solidifying, during what was traditionally known as the Dark Ages, where it was hardening into the system that it is today. But you see the rise of the Karaites and other ideas, but also the importance of keeping that one religion, and how arguments and debates can cause schisms. And hopefully, as B'nai Noah can learn from all this, that no, we don't want to see drama and dissension happen, but we want to see growth. Hey, Lara, shalom. Anyways, okay, I got to go study for an exam this afternoon, so I'm going to step out for today. But please join me tomorrow for more Rocky Mountain readings, where we're going to continue in this book, The Talmud, a Biography. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Have a beautiful day. Bye for now.